He hadn't touched the doorknob in 3 years, not since Eleanor, and now a small gray cat was insisting he open it. The sound wasn't for him. He was sure of it. It wasn't the hungry, demanding meow of a stray looking for a handout. He knew that sound well enough. The neighborhood had its share of them, ghost-like figures that would appear at his kitchen window, press a desperate face to the glass for a moment, and then melt back into the shadows. He'd leave out food for them sometimes on the back porch, a silent transaction that asked for nothing in return. But this was different. This was a sound that belonged to the hallway. Specifically, to the end of the hallway, where the afternoon sun never reached and the floorboards always held a deep, persistent chill. It was a single questioning note. A soft, clear meow that rose in the quiet of the house around dusk, every single day, for 6 straight weeks. And it was always directed at the same door, the basement door. It was the one door in the house he never, ever used. It was painted a flat, unassuming white, now peeling slightly at the edges, revealing the darker wood beneath like an old wound. A thin, cold draft always seeped from the gap at the bottom, smelling of damp concrete, forgotten earth, and something else. Something that reminded him of her, of oil paints and turpentine and the mineral scent of wet clay. Eleanor's studio had been down there, her sanctuary. The sound came again. Meow? Arthur sat in his worn armchair in the living room, the book in his lap unread for the last hour. The silence in the house was a living thing. It had weight. It pressed down on him, filled the empty spaces on the couch beside him, settled in the dust on her piano. He had grown accustomed to the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the pipes, the distant sigh of traffic from the main road. But this new sound, this little insistent question, aimed at a place of memory and pain. It was a pebble dropped into the still, stagnant water of his life. At first, he'd ignored it. The first week, he'd assumed it was a fluke. A cat caught in the enclosed alleyway between his house and the neighbors, its voice echoing in a strange way. It would move on. They always did. By the second week, he found himself listening for it. He'd be washing his single dinner plate, his hands submerged in warm, soapy water, and he'd pause, head cocked, waiting. And right on schedule, as the sky outside turned the color of a deep bruise, it would come. Meow? A sound so gentle it felt like it was being spoken directly into the wood of the door itself. By the third week, he had to see. He put his plate down, dried his hands on a dish towel, and walked slowly, his socked feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow from the living room behind him. He stopped a few feet from the basement door, his breath catching in his throat. And there she was. She wasn't much to look at. A small, slender cat, her fur the color of ash, mottled with darker stripes that were barely visible in the dim light. She wasn't looking at him. Her entire being, every ounce of her focus, was directed at the door. She was sitting perfectly still, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws, her head tilted. She looked less like an animal and more like a little, gray statue of longing. She made the sound again without turning. Meow? It wasn't for him. It was a question for whatever was behind that door, or for whatever wasn't behind it anymore. Arthur felt a strange, cold prickle on his arms. It made no sense. How could a cat, a stray he'd never seen before, have any connection to that room? It was impossible. He was just a lonely old man projecting his own grief onto a dumb animal. That's what his daughter would say, in that gentle, pitying tone she used with him now. Dad, it's just a cat. He backed away slowly, retreating, to the relative safety of his armchair, but the image of her stayed with him, the sheer, unwavering intensity of her vigil. The days bled into weeks. The world outside turned from the crispness of late autumn to the stark, brittle cold of early winter. The cat was always there. Sometimes, when he'd leave for groceries, he'd see her from the corner of his eye, a smudge of gray near the side of the house, waiting. She never came to the front door, never went to the back porch where the other strays knew to find food. Only the basement door. Her fur was getting thicker, a winter coat coming in, but she looked thin, too thin. The cold was setting in, the kind that seeped into your bones. One evening, the sky was heavy with the promise of the first snow. The air had that metallic tang, that profound, aching stillness. And the sound from the hallway seemed weaker, more fragile. Meow! It was barely a whisper. Something inside Arthur cracked. Some wall of resolute solitude he had so carefully constructed over the last 3 years. He couldn't let her starve out there, not while she was keeping this strange, inexplicable watch over his wife's memory. It felt like a betrayal to both of them. He opened a can of tuna, the smell filling the quiet kitchen. He spooned it onto a small saucer, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't know why he was so nervous. "It's just a cat," he told himself again. He walked down the hall, the saucer cold in his hand. The cat was there, in her usual spot. As he approached, she finally turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were a startling, luminous green. They weren't frightened. They were just watching, assessing. He bent down slowly, his knees creaking, in protest. He placed the saucer on the floor, about 5 feet away from her. He didn't want to scare her off. "Here," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. "You should eat something." She didn't move. She just stared at him, those green eyes holding his. He felt an absurd need to explain himself, to explain the door. "There's nothing in there," he said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the silence. It's just a basement, just storage." A lie. It wasn't just storage. It was a tomb of half-finished canvases, dried-up tubes of paint, and a potter's wheel covered in a dusty white sheet. It was a room full of her laughter, her frustrations, her scent. It was the heart of the home, and he had locked it away. The cat blinked slowly. One of those long, languid blinks that he'd read somewhere signified trust. Then she looked down at the saucer of tuna, then back at the door, as if weighing her options, her purpose versus her hunger. Slowly, cautiously, she rose to her feet and padded toward the food. She was so slight, her paws making no sound at all. As she passed the sliver of light coming from the living room, he saw something that made his breath hitch. On the very tip of her left ear, almost invisible against the gray fur, was a tiny, impossibly small fleck of blue. Cerulean blue. It was Eleanor's favorite color. It was the color of the sky in her, landscapes, the color of the irises in her self-portraits, the color she'd accidentally gotten on everything, the laundry, the dog, her own hair. He hadn't seen that exact, vibrant shade of blue in 3 years. Not since he'd packed away her last painting, unable to bear the sight of it. His heart started a slow, heavy thud in his chest. It had to be a coincidence, a speck of paint from anywhere, a bit of litter, a scrap of plastic. It had to be. But as he stood there, watching this little gray cat finally eat, a quiet, unnerving knowledge began to settle in his soul. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. Something had begun. And he had a chilling, terrifying feeling that it would end with him having to open that door. You're here listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The saucer was empty, licked clean with a meticulousness that spoke of true hunger. But the little gray cat hadn't left. After her meal, she had taken a few moments to groom a patch of fur on her shoulder, a small domestic act that seemed wildly out of place in the cold, forgotten hallway. Arthur remained frozen by the entrance, his shadow long and distorted behind him. He expected her to bolt, to vanish back into the alleyway she'd come from, the transaction of food for company complete. Instead, she simply walked back to the basement door. She settled into her exact same spot, a perfect mirror of the posture she held before, and fixed her gaze on the peeling white paint. She was no longer hungry, but her purpose remained. The food had been a necessity, a brief intermission. The vigil was the point. A profound and unsettling quiet settled between them. It was broken only by her, a few minutes later, when she let out the soft, familiar sound, now tinged with a different quality. Not quite as desperate, more like a gentle reminder. Imrao? Arthur finally breathed out, a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry some of the dust from his own lungs. He backed away, collected the empty saucer, and retreated to the living room. But he didn't sit down. He stood by the window, looking out at the bare, skeletal branches of the oak tree in his yard, seeing nothing. The little fleck of cerulean blue on her ear replayed in his mind, an anomaly. A tiny, impossible detail in the gray landscape of his life. And so began their strange, silent dance. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the neighboring rooftops and bled purple and orange into the sky, he would hear her. He started to call her echo in his mind, because her call seemed to be a question sent out to the past, hoping for a reply from a room that no longer held a voice. He would open a can of food, he'd bought a variety, unsure of her preference, and place it in the same spot in the hallway. For the first few days, he would retreat immediately, watching from the doorway of the living room as she ate. She would not approach the food until he was a safe distance away. The space between them was a physical measure of her caution, and he was careful not to cross it. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. Winter was no longer a promise, it was a guest that had moved in and put its feet up. A thin layer of frost now silvered the lawn each morning, and the windows were perpetually fogged with condensation. Arthur found himself adding a second feeding to the routine, leaving a small bowl of dry food for her in the morning, which would be gone by the time he checked at noon. He never saw her eat it. She was a creature of the dusk. He started talking to her. Not in full sentences, just quiet murmurs that felt less like a conversation and more like thinking out loud. "Getting cold out there, little one," he'd whisper as he set down the food. "There you are, right on time." She would just watch. Him, her green eyes luminous in the growing dark, making no sound until he had backed away and she had finished her meal. Then, and only then, would she return to her station and address the door with her soft, plaintive question. He learned her movements, the subtle language of her body. An ear twitched toward the sound of the house settling, the slow, almost imperceptible, kneading of her paws on the threadbare rug when she was relaxed. He noticed the way she avoided the one floorboard that always creaked, an innate map of the house's secrets that she seemed to possess. One afternoon, a heavy, wet snow began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque flakes of Christmas cards, but thick, clumping blankets of white that quickly obscured the world. The wind picked up, rattling the old window frames, a mournful, whistling sound that got under his skin. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Where did she go during the day? Where did she shelter from this? He pictured her curled up somewhere in the frozen alley, covered in a drift of snow, and the thought caused a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. It was concern. Real, aching concern. It had been so long since he'd felt it for anything, due. You think they know when we need them most? The question floated up from somewhere deep inside him, unbidden. Did this little creature, with her impossible speck of blue paint and her fixation on his past, somehow understand that she was the only thing anchoring him to the present? He couldn't bring her inside. Not yet. To open the door to his house felt like opening the door to his life, and he wasn't ready. The grief was still too raw, the quiet too fragile. To let another living thing in, another heartbeat, felt like a betrayal of the stillness he and Eleanor's memory now shared. But he couldn't leave her out in the storm either. He found himself in the garage, the cold air biting at his exposed hands. He rummaged through old boxes, his breath pluming in front of him. He found a sturdy cardboard box that once held a microwave. Then, he went to a trunk in the corner, one he hadn't opened in years. He lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of lavender and linseed oil filled the air. Eleanor's scent. Inside were her painting clothes. Smocks, old flannel shirts, jeans stiff with gesso. He pulled out a thick, dark blue flannel shirt, covered in a galaxy of multicolored paint specks. He held it to his face for a moment, his eyes closed. It was like inhaling a memory. He folded it carefully and placed it inside the box. He took the box to the small, covered alcove on the side of the house, right next to the basement door's exterior. He packed it with old newspapers for insulation, placed the flannel shirt inside like a plush mattress, and positioned it so the opening was shielded from the driving wind. "Here," he said to the empty, snow-swept space, "just in case you need it." He felt foolish. He was a grown man building a fort for a cat who might not even use it. But as he went back inside, shaking the snow from his coat, a small measure of the tightness in his chest had eased. That night, she was late. Dusk came and went. The hallway remained empty. The house was utterly silent, the snow outside having muffled the world into a deep, profound hush. Arthur paced the length of the living room, stopping at the window, peering into the swirling white, then walking to the hallway, staring at the vacant spot by the door. The silence was different now. It wasn't the familiar, heavy quiet of his solitude. It was an empty silence, a silence defined by an absence, by the lack of a single, questioning meow. He ate his dinner standing up in the kitchen, his stomach in a knot. He left her food out, but the scent of it just made the emptiness feel more acute. He went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay there, listening to the wind, listening for the faint scratch of paws, for anything. The next morning, the world was a pristine, unbroken field of white. The storm had passed. The first thing he did, before even making coffee, was check the hallway. The food was untouched, cold. The spot by the door was empty. A real, sharp fear gripped him. It was irrational, he knew. She was a stray. Strays disappeared. They found warmer shelters, they moved on. But she hadn't been just a stray. She had been a presence, a purpose, a question he couldn't answer but felt compelled to listen to. He spent the day in a fog, unable to settle. He tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes. He tried to watch television, but the sound felt intrusive and hollow. The whole house felt wrong. Too big, too quiet. He found himself standing at the end of the hallway, staring at the basement door, as if trying to understand its power over her, its pull. He placed his hand on the cold brass knob, his fingers tracing the intricate design he hadn't truly looked at in years. He almost turned it, but the thought of the cold, still air that would meet him, the sight of the sheet-covered ghost of her potter's wheel, he couldn't. He snatched his hand back as if burned. That evening, as the low winter sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow, he heard it. A faint sound from the side of the house, a soft scratching. His heart leaped. He rushed to the side door, the one in the kitchen he rarely used, and fumbled with the lock. He pulled it open and a blast of frigid air hit him. There she was, sitting on the top step, looking up at him. She was dusted with snow, her whiskers jeweled with tiny beads of ice. She looked tired, worn to the bone. But she was there. She blinked her luminous green eyes at him and let out a soft, tired meow. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding his breath. "You're back," he breathed, the words turning to vapor in the cold. "You're back." He backed away from the door, leaving it ajar, a silent invitation. He hurried to the hallway to get her food. When he returned to the kitchen, she was standing just inside the doorway, shaking the cold from her paws, leaving little damp spots on the linoleum. She had never come inside before. He put her food down on the floor, and this time he didn't retreat to the living room. He just slid down the kitchen wall and sat on the cold floor, his back against the cabinets, and watched her eat. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if gathering her strength. When she was finished, she licked her paws clean, then looked at him. He held perfectly still, barely breathing. She took a tentative step toward him, then another. She didn't come to his lap. She didn't rub against his hand. She simply walked, a slow, deliberate path past him. But as she did, she leaned her body just slightly, allowing her side, for a single, fleeting second, to brush against the worn denim of his jeans. It was the lightest, most ephemeral touch. The faint warmth of her fur, the soft pressure of her small body. It was nothing, and it was everything. A current of warmth shot through him, a feeling so foreign and so welcome, it almost made him weep. It was the first living, affectionate touch he'd felt in 3 years. She continued her journey, padding silently out of the kitchen and down the hall. Arthur listened, his eyes closed, and a moment later he heard it. The reason she had come back. The purpose that drove her through snow and cold, back to this house of memories. From the end of the hall, quiet and steadfast, came the sound. Meow? The touch was a beginning. A fragile bridge built across a vast silence. After that night in the snowstorm, Echo, as he now officially called her in the quiet of his own mind, seemed to understand that the house was a safe harbor. She still vanished. During the day, a little gray wisp of a creature on her own mysterious errands. But every evening, without fail, as the light began to fade from the sky, she would appear at the kitchen door. She no longer waited for him to open it. She would simply sit, a patient silhouette against the frosted glass, and he would feel her. Presence, a faint but certain pull, and let her in, their ritual solidified. She would eat from her bowl on the kitchen floor while he leaned against the counter, sipping a cup of tea. He felt the warmth of the mug seep into his hands, a comforting anchor in the unfolding strangeness of his life. After her meal, she would perform her meticulous grooming and then make the journey. She would pad down the hallway, her steps now confident, and on her way, she would repeat the gesture that had undone him. A soft, deliberate brush against his leg as he sat in his armchair, reading or pretending to read. It was a fleeting acknowledgement, a quiet hello that spoke more than any meow could. And then, she would take up her post at the basement door. Her vigil continued, but it felt different now. Less desperate, more certain. As if she knew she was no longer alone in it. Arthur found himself sitting on the top step of the stairs that led to the second floor, just watching her. He was a spectator to her solemn duty. The two of them, man and cat, holding a silent, shared watch over a door that held a lifetime of memories. And then, one evening in late January, the ritual changed. She came in as usual, the cold night air clinging to her fur, like a cloak. She ate her food, brushed past his leg, and walked down the hallway. Arthur listened for the familiar, soft meow, but it didn't come. Instead, he heard a faint scratching sound, a tiny, repetitive scrape against the wood. Curious, he got up from his chair and walked to the hallway. Echo was at the door, but she was busy. She was nudging something with her nose, pushing it into place at the very base of the door, directly over the thin, dark gap. When she was satisfied, she stepped back and looked up, not at the door, but at the object she had brought. Arthur knelt down, his old knees protesting. Lying on the dark wood of the floor was a single, perfect feather. It was from a blue jay, a vibrant slash of cobalt and black, as if someone had chipped a piece off the daytime sky and left it there. It was beautiful and strange. An offering. He looked at Echo. She was staring at the feather, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the door, and finally she let out her soft, questioning call. "What is this, little one?" he whispered, a smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "A gift?" He reached out and picked it up. The feather was light as air, yet it felt heavy with meaning. He didn't know what to do with it, so he took it to the living room and placed it in a small, empty ceramic dish on the mantelpiece. A dish Eleanor had made, its glaze the color of a robin's egg. He thought it was a one-time thing, a cat's strange whim, but the next night it happened again. This time she brought a dried maple leaf, its edges curled and brittle, its color a faded, fiery red. She placed it in the exact same spot at the base of the door. Arthur collected it and placed it in the dish next to the feather. The third night, she brought a small, smooth, gray stone worn round by water. The fourth, a scrap of tattered moss green, velvet, impossibly soft, every night a new treasure, a new offering left at the altar of the basement door. His mantelpiece was slowly turning into a tiny, curated museum of Echo's findings. It was bizarre. It was inexplicable. But it was also tender. It felt like she was trying to communicate something using the language of found things. His worry for her, which had been a simple fear for her survival, began to change. It deepened, twisted into something more complex. Where was she finding these things? The velvet, the stone. They seemed specific. Chosen. Have you ever felt like you were receiving a message from a place you couldn't explain? He'd find himself staring at the collection of small objects, the question turning over and over in his mind. He was a practical man, an accountant before he retired. He dealt in numbers, in ledgers, in things that made sense. This made no sense. And yet, his heart insisted on trying to read the story she was writing for him, one object at a time. He started to worry when she was gone during the day. He'd find himself looking out the window, scanning the quiet, snow-covered neighborhood for a flash of gray. He was becoming attached, and the depth of that attachment frightened him. This fragile connection, this strange, shared ritual had become the new center of his life. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was all leading him to that door, that one day her little gifts wouldn't be enough. She would demand more. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in February. The sky had been a flat, oppressive white all day. A coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature had settled deep in his bones. Echo came in that evening, shaking melted snow from her paws. She ate her dinner, but with a strange, distracted air. She seemed agitated. She bypassed their usual ritual of brushing against his leg and walked straight down the hallway. Arthur followed, a sense of foreboding tightening his chest. She was carrying something in her mouth, something pale that glinted in the dim light. She set it down carefully, nudging it into place with more precision than ever before. She stepped back, and Arthur leaned closer to see. His breath caught in his throat. It felt as though the air had been punched from his lungs. Lying there, on the floorboards he hadn't polished in 3 years, was a small, mother-of-pearl button. It wasn't just any button. He knew it instantly. It was small, iridescent, with a tiny 4-holed flower pattern etched into its center. It was from Eleanor's favorite cardigan, a soft, cream-colored thing she wore whenever she was working in her studio, even in the summer. He remembered the cardigan distinctly because one button had been loose for months. She'd kept meaning to fix it. He remembered the feel of it under his hand when he'd put his arm around her shoulders. He sank to the floor, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He stared at the button, a tiny, gleaming ghost from his past. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. She could have found it in the yard. It could have fallen off long ago. It could be a similar button from a neighbor's discarded clothes. It could be anything, but he knew it wasn't. He knew with a terrifying, gut-level certainty that it was her button, from her cardigan. He'd packed all her clothes away himself. He'd sealed them in boxes, taped them shut, and what? Where had he put them? He remembered carrying boxes heavy with the weight of her absence. He had taken some to the attic, some to the garage, and had he taken some to the basement? To the back corner of her studio, to deal with later? The memory was a thick, impenetrable fog. The days and weeks after she was gone were a blur of grief and numbness. He couldn't remember. He looked at Echo. She wasn't looking at the button. She was looking at him. Her green eyes were wide, and for the first time, they seemed to hold not a question, but an urgent plea. He picked up the button, its surface cool and smooth against his trembling fingertips. He felt like he was losing his mind. Like the quiet solitude of his house had finally curdled into a quiet madness. He stood up, the button clutched in his fist, and walked back to the living room. He didn't put this one in the dish. He slipped it into his pocket where it rested like a cold, hard stone. He waited for Echo to ask to be let out, to disappear back into the night and leave him alone with the ghost she had brought him. He sat in his chair, staring at the empty hallway, listening. but the scratch at the kitchen door never came. An hour passed. The house was silent. He finally got up and walked back to the hallway, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She was still there. But everything was different. She wasn't sitting. She was standing, her body tense, her tail low. Her vigil had changed. And as he watched, she opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was not her usual gentle query. It was a sharp, insistent series of mews. Meow, meow, meow. A demand, a summons. She looked at the door, then back at him, her eyes burning, with an unmistakable intensity. She was done asking the door. She was asking him. Then, she did something that shattered the last of his resistance. She turned away from the basement door, walked directly to him, and pressed her head firmly into his trembling hand, a gesture of profound trust and expectation. She held it there for a long moment, a silent transfer of weight, of responsibility. Then she stepped back, walked the few paces back to the door, turned, and looked at him. And she waited. Her message was clear, delivered without a single sound. He could understand, but with a meaning that resonated in the deepest part of his soul. The time for leaving gifts was over. The time for waiting was over. He had to open the door. Now. The world shrank to the space of the hallway, to the peeling white paint of the basement door and the small gray cat who stood before it like a sentinel demanding he finally pay the toll. Her eyes held him captive. There was no questioning in them now, no gentle patience. There was only a raw, urgent certainty. The insistent mews had stopped. The air was thick with her silent, unwavering demand. He felt the phantom pressure of her head against his hand, a transfer of a burden he could no longer ignore. Arthur's own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. For 3 years, this door had been a dam holding back a flood of grief. He had convinced himself that what was behind it was memory, and that memory was a ghost, and it was best to let ghosts lie. To open it felt like a violation, a desecration, of the perfect, painful stillness he had curated. But Echo's eyes told a different story. She wasn't afraid of what was behind the door. She was desperate for it. And she believed with the pure, unshakable faith of an animal that he was the key. He looked from her intense green gaze to the cold brass doorknob. His hand, as if acting of its own accord, began to lift. It trembled, the fine tremor of an old man, or perhaps just a man who had been still for too long. He thought of Eleanor. He could almost hear her voice, a gentle chiding. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Arthur. Just open the door." His fingers brushed against the brass. It was ice, cold. He wrapped his hand around it and turned. Nothing. It was locked. Of course it was locked. He had locked it himself on that last terrible day when he'd finally brought himself to close it, to seal away her laughter and the smell of her paints. The key. Where was the key? His mind, already reeling, went blank. He hadn't seen it, touched it, thought about it in 1,000 days. Echo let out a single, sharp mew of frustration. She looked at his hand on the knob, then back at his face. Her gaze was so intelligent, so penetrating, it felt as though she were trying to pull the memory from him. And then, it came to him. A flash of a memory, so clear it was like a photograph. Eleanor, her hair tied up in a messy bun, a smudge of that cerulean blue on her cheek, laughing as she hung the key on a small hidden hook. "So you don't lose it, you absent-minded professor," she'd said, the hook inside the hall closet, behind the coats. He moved as if in a trance. He walked to the closet, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Echo stayed by the basement door, her eyes following his every move. He pulled the closet door open, the scent of cedar and old wool washing over him. He pushed aside his heavy winter coat, a garment he hadn't worn in years. And there, behind it, obscured by shadows, was the small, simple brass hook, and on it, a single, ornate skeleton key. His hand was surprisingly steady as he took it. He walked back to the door. This was it. There were no more delays, no more Excuses. He slid the key into the lock. The sound of the metal scraping against the old tumblers was deafening in the silence. It was the sound of the past being disturbed. He turned it. A loud, grating click echoed through the hallway, a sound of finality. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and apprehension. He pulled the doorknob and the door swung inward, with a low, mournful groan like a long-held sigh. A wave of air hit him first. Cold, damp. The familiar earthy scent of the concrete floor, the sharp chemical tang of turpentine, the mineral smell of dried clay. But underneath it all, there was something else. A faint, musky animal scent. The smell of fur, of life, of a long slept-in den. Echo didn't wait. She darted past his legs, a streak of gray disappearing into the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. Arthur reached a trembling hand around the doorframe, searching for the light switch. His fingers found the old, cold toggle. He flipped it. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over the room, and his heart broke all over again. It was exactly as he'd left it. A perfect, dusty tableau of a life interrupted. Her potter's wheel stood in the center, shrouded in a white sheet that had turned gray with neglect. Canvases were stacked against the far wall, their faces turned away from him. Jars filled with murky water and stiffened brushes lined a workbench. A fine layer of dust covered everything, a soft gray snow of forgotten time. It was a tomb. His first instinct was to close the door, to shut it all away again. But then he heard a sound from the bottom of the stairs, a soft, chuffing noise, and then Echo's gentle meow. He forced his feet to move, one step at a time, down the steep wooden stairs. Each step creaked, protesting his weight. The air grew colder as he descended. He reached the bottom, his eyes scanning the familiar, painful landscape of the studio. Echo was not by the potter's wheel or the workbench. She was in the far, dark corner of the room, a space partially hidden by an old wooden bookshelf that had been laid on its side years ago to serve as a low table for her supplies. She was standing beside it, looking back at him, waiting. He walked toward her, his shoes crunching softly on the dusty concrete. As he got closer, he saw it. Behind the bookshelf, in the old stone foundation of the house, was a small, dark opening, a place where a single large stone had been removed long ago, creating a passage to the outside world. It was Eleanor's secret entrance for the strays she sometimes tended to. A cat door, she'd called it, and in the sheltered space between the bookshelf and the wall, on a pile of what looked like old, tattered rags, something moved. Arthur's blood ran cold. He slowly, carefully, leaned over the bookshelf, his joints aching, and he saw. It wasn't a litter of kittens, as he might have half expected. It was a single old cat, a ginger Tom, his fur patchy and dull, his body painfully thin. His eyes were cloudy with age, and he was curled into a tight ball, shivering slightly despite the makeshift nest. And Arthur knew him. His breath left him in a ragged gasp. He stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. The world tilted on its axis. It was Sunny, a friendly, battle-scarred neighborhood stray that Eleanor had adored. He had been her constant companion in the studio, coming and going through the little hole in the wall. She'd fed him, talked to him, even used him as a model for a series of sketches. After she passed, Sunny had simply disappeared. Arthur, lost in his own fog of grief, had vaguely assumed the old cat had moved on or had succumbed to the harshness of a stray's life. He had been wrong. He hadn't just moved on. He had been trapped. The hole in the wall was open, but Sunny was now too old, too weak, too sick to use it regularly. This basement, this warm, dry place of memory, had become his final sanctuary. And his prison. And Echo. Arthur looked at the little gray cat, who was now nudging the old Tom with her head, a soft purr rumbling in her chest. She wasn't his mate. She wasn't his mother. She was his keeper, his nurse, his unwavering, loyal friend. The truth crashed down on Arthur with the force of a physical blow. The 6 weeks of meowing, the patient, desperate vigil. It wasn't for a ghost. It wasn't for a memory. It was a plea, a desperate, continuous cry for help for the one friend she had in the world. The food he'd been leaving out, she hadn't been eating it all herself. She had been bringing it here, to him. The gifts she'd left at the door, the feather, the leaf, the button from Eleanor's cardigan that must have been part of Sunny's bedding, they weren't random. They were clues. They were the only language she had to tell him that something, living, something precious was down here, fading away. Do you think animals are capable of a love that deep, a loyalty that asks for nothing in return? Looking at the two of them, the small, healthy cat caring for the frail old one, Arthur knew the answer. A wave of shame and guilt so profound it buckled his knees washed over him. He had been so wrapped up in his own pain, his own loss, that he had been deaf to a desperate call for help happening just feet from where he sat every single day. He had been mourning a memory while a real living tragedy was unfolding beneath his floorboards. He slid down to his knees, the hard concrete, cold against his legs. He didn't realize he was crying until he felt a tear splash onto the back of his hand. Silent, hot tears streamed down his weathered cheeks for his wife, for this old, dying cat, for this brave little messenger, and for his own blind, selfish grief. He felt a soft pressure against his hand. He looked down. Echo had left Sunny's side. She had walked over to him, this broken, weeping man, and she was pressing her small, furry head into the palm of his hand. She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and full of a deep, trusting intelligence. She nudged his hand once, twice, a solid, comforting weight. And then she leaned in and gently, with her small, rough tongue, licked away one of the tears from his skin. The gesture was so full of grace, of forgiveness, of love, it shattered what was left of his composure. He finally understood. He looked around the dusty, silent room at the two cats, at the ghost of his wife's life. Echo hadn't been trying to pull him back into the past. She hadn't been meowing at a memory trapped behind the door. All this time, she had been meowing at him. She was trying to get him to open the door not just to a basement, but to the world of the living, to caring, to helping, to love. And in his dark, quiet house, in his dark, quiet life, he had finally heard her. The bright, sterile silence of the emergency vet's waiting room was a world away from the dusty, memory-laden air of the basement. Arthur sat on a hard plastic chair, a cardboard box resting on his lap. Inside, curled on one of Eleanor's old soft flannel shirts, was the frail body of the old ginger cat, Sunny. Echo was not in the box. She was in Arthur's arms, tucked inside his coat, a warm, trembling, living weight against his chest. She had refused to be left behind, her little body going rigid with panic when he'd tried to leave her at the house. He hadn't had the heart to force it. They were in this together. Every few minutes, Echo would poke her head out, her wide, green eyes scanning the alien environment, before she'd look up at Arthur, as if for reassurance. He'd stroke her head, his own heart a slow, heavy drum. He wasn't just a man in a waiting room. He was a guardian, a custodian of a love so fierce and loyal it had broken through the walls of his own grief. He would not fail it, not now. The vet was a young woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. She didn't show any surprise at the story Arthur haltingly told her of the locked door, the vigil, the discovery. She simply nodded, her expression full of a soft understanding, as if she knew that the strangest stories were often the truest. Her diagnosis was what Arthur had expected. Sunny was very old. He was suffering from severe malnutrition, kidney failure, and the simple, irreversible condition of a long, hard life catching up to him. There was no miracle cure. There were no grand heroics to be performed. There was only kindness. "We can make him comfortable," she'd said, her voice soft. "Give him fluids, some proper nutrition, ease his pain. We can give him a good end to his story." A good end to his story. The words echoed in Arthur's mind. That's what Echo had been asking for all along. Not a miracle. Just a little mercy. A gentle exit. He brought Sunny home the next day. The vet had offered to keep him, but Arthur refused. He wouldn't let the old cat's final days be spent in a metal cage. He belonged at home, but not in the basement. Never again in the basement. Arthur made him a bed in a warm, sunlit corner of the living room, using a wicker basket lined with the softest towels he owned. For the first time in 3 years, the living room wasn't just a waiting room for Arthur's own eventual end. It was a sick room, a place of care, a place of purpose. And so began the last chapter of Sonny's life, and the first chapter of Arthur's. His days, once empty and formless, now had a rhythm. There was medicine to administer, a dropper full of nutrient-rich liquid he'd gently squeeze into the old cat's mouth. There was soft food to mash up, which Sonny would eat with a slow, grateful weariness. There were towels to be changed and warmed in the dryer. Arthur, the retired accountant who had spent 40 years managing ledgers and balancing accounts, now found himself managing the final, precious account of a small, forgotten life. And through it all, Echo was there. She was his shadow, his supervisor, his partner in care. Her frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady presence. She would spend hours curled up in the wicker basket, her small, healthy body pressed against Sonny's frail one, a silent offering of warmth and comfort. She would groom his patchy fur with her little pink tongue, a task he was now too weak to perform himself. When Arthur would come to give Sonny his medicine, she would watch him with those intelligent green eyes, and when he was done, she would often give his hand a quick, grateful lick before turning her attention back to her friend. In caring for Sonny, Arthur began to care for himself. He started opening the windows, letting the crisp winter air flush out the stale, stagnant atmosphere of the house. He found himself cleaning, really cleaning, for the first time in years. He scrubbed the kitchen floor. He washed the curtains. He dusted shelves that hadn't been touched since Eleanor was alive. With every swipe of the cloth, it felt like he was wiping away not just dust, but a layer of his own sorrow. The house began to breathe again, and so did he. One afternoon, he even went back down into the basement. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, the single bulb illuminating the room, and he did not feel the crushing weight of grief. He felt only a profound sense of peace. He looked at the sheet-covered potter's wheel, and he didn't see a tombstone. He saw the place where his wife had been her most vibrant, most joyful self. He walked over to the hole in the foundation, and using some old bricks and mortar he found in the garage, he sealed it up for good. Its purpose had been served. Sonny lived for 3 more weeks. They were quiet, gentle weeks. The pain left his old body, and in its place came a kind of peace. He would lie in his sunbeam, purring a weak, rattling purr as Arthur stroked his back. His last evening he was particularly calm. Echo lay with him, her head resting on his paws. Arthur sat on the floor beside the basket, his hand resting gently on the old cat's side, feeling the slow, shallow rise and fall of his breath. Around midnight, the breathing simply stopped. There was no struggle, no cry. Just a gentle release. One moment he was there, the next, he was gone. Arthur felt it the second it happened. Echo seemed to feel it too. She lifted her head, let out a tiny, soft meow, and then she began to purr, a deep, rumbling sound, as if she were singing her old friend to his final rest. Arthur sat there for a long time, his hand on Sonny's now still body, and he cried. But these were not the bitter, ragged tears of his own grief. They were clean, quiet tears of sorrow, of gratitude, and of love. For a life that had been saved from a lonely end. He buried him the next morning under the big oak tree in the backyard, in the very spot where a patch of sun always seemed to land. The storm had passed, but nothing was the same. The house was quieter than ever, but the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. Echo saw to that. With her mission complete, she seemed to finally accept that this house was her home, and that Arthur was her person. She would now sleep on the end of his bed, a warm weight on his feet that grounded him even in his dreams. She would sit on the arm of his chair while he read, occasionally reaching out a paw to gently touch the page, as if to remind him she was there. Her desperate meows at the basement door were a thing of the past. Her vigil was over. She was just a cat now. A happy, quirky, endlessly loving cat. She still came and go as she pleased, a creature of her own mind, but she always came back. He was her anchor now. Spring arrived, slowly at first, then all at once. The world outside turned green and vibrant. The days grew longer, warmer. Arthur felt the change in himself, a thawing that mirrored the season. He reconnected with his daughter, who was astonished at the change in his voice over the phone. He even had a neighbor over for coffee. Life, it turned out, had not been finished with him. One warm Saturday afternoon, driven by this new energy, he decided to finally tackle the last corner of the basement. He was going to sort through Eleanor's canvases and portfolios, not to throw them away, but to organize them, to honor them. He spent hours down there, the space now clean and aired out, a peaceful workshop once more. He looked through her paintings, the vibrant landscapes, the intimate portraits. He smiled, remembering the stories behind each one. The pain was gone, replaced by a warm, sweet nostalgia. Finally, he came to a large, leather-bound portfolio tucked away behind a stack of canvases. He didn't recognize it. He untied the ribbon and opened it on the workbench. It was filled with sketches. Dozens and dozens of them, all done in charcoal, and they were all of the same subject. A battle-scarred, one-eared ginger tomcat. It was Sunny. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He slowly turned the pages, his calloused fingers tracing the lines of the drawings. Eleanor had captured him perfectly. Sunny sleeping in a patch of sun that streamed through the small basement window. Sunny batting playfully at the end of a paintbrush. Sunny yawning, his mouth a perfect O. Each sketch was dated, chronicling their secret studio friendship. He came to the last page. It was less a finished drawing and more a quick, fleeting impression. It showed Sunny, curled in his usual sleeping position. But beside him, tucked into the curve of his body, was another much smaller shape. A tiny, fuzzy kitten, a little smudge, of gray, its face turned up toward the old Tom's. Underneath it, in his wife's familiar, elegant script, were two words, Sunny's Echo. Arthur stared at the page, the world falling away. His heart felt like it was expanding in his chest. A gift. This was Eleanor's final gift to him. She had known. All those years ago, she had seen the beginning of their story. She had seen the tiny gray kitten, the little echo of the old ginger, cat she so adored. She had known about their bond. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't magic. It was a simple, unbroken line of love. The love Eleanor showed an old stray had inspired a fierce loyalty in a little gray cat, a loyalty that drove her to refuse to let him die alone, a loyalty that led her to the door, that led her to him, that saved them all. He closed the portfolio, his movements slow and reverent. He walked back up the stairs and into the light-filled living room. Echo was there, dozing on the windowsill, her gray fur glowing in the afternoon sun. He walked over to her and gently stroked her back. She opened her green eyes, blinked slowly, and began to purr. He looked around the room, at the comfortable chair, at the photos of his wife that he could now smile at the little ceramic dish on the mantelpiece. Inside, it rested a single blue jay feather and a small iridescent mother-of-pearl button. He went back downstairs, carefully tore the final sketch from the portfolio, and when he returned, he propped it up in the dish behind them. A tiny shrine, not to what was lost, but to what had been found. He had thought his house was empty, a place defined only by a devastating absence. He finally understood he had been wrong. It hadn't been empty at all. It had been waiting, patiently and quietly, to be filled. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.